Marshal Lannes pushed his troops to the gates of Saragossa, but as he lacked heavy artillery to besiege that city, in which more than 60,000 men, soldiers and peasants, had shut themselves up, he contented himself for the moment with having the principal approaches guarded, and, handing over the command to Marshal Moncey, he set out to rejoin the Emperor, as his instructions required. I have said that Marshal Lannes had fallen ill. He could not therefore travel at full gallop, as he had on the way out. A carriage was found at Tudela, and relays were set up with the army train's horses. Although I knew that the marshal, wishing to sleep every night, would cover only some 20 leagues per day, I foresaw that the journey would be very painful for me, for aides-de-camp must follow the marshal's carriage at full gallop, and I felt that the movement of a galloping horse, which I was about to endure for several hours a day over 7 or 8 days, would aggravate the dreadful pains caused by my wound. But the marshal had the kindness to give me a place in his carriage, where Generals Pouzet and Frère, his 2 friends, were also seated. They loved to talk, and even to make merry at their neighbors' expense, and as they had known me only a short time, my presence at first embarrassed them, but the marshal having said, "He is a good fellow, you may speak in front of him," they took him fully at his word. This journey was very hard for me, although we rested every night. We saw Logroño, Miranda, Burgos again, and climbed on foot the famous pass of Somosierra, carried a few days earlier, under the Emperor's eyes, by the Polish lancers of his guard, who that day saw fire for the first time. This action gave General Montbrun, since become famous, the chance to distinguish himself. Montbrun was following headquarters when the Emperor, marching from Aranda toward Madrid, and a few hours ahead of his infantry, reached the foot of the Somosierra with only the Polish lancers. The highway, very steep at that point and hemmed in between 2 mountains, was barred by a small fieldwork defended by a few thousand Spaniards. Napoleon, who wished to reach Buitrago that very day, finding his march checked and calculating that the infantry could not arrive for a long while, ordered the Poles to force the pass. The Poles have but one quality, yet they possess it in the highest degree. They are generally very brave. Their leaders, having no knowledge of war, which they had never waged, did not know that to pass a defile it is necessary to leave between squadrons an open interval equal to each squadron's depth, so that, if the foremost are repulsed, they find open ground behind them to reform and do not collide with the squadrons that follow. The Polish officers therefore hurled the regiment rashly into the pass without taking proper measures. But, greeted on both flanks by a hail of bullets and finding the road barred at the summit, they suffered all the more severely as the first squadron, thrown back in disorder, crashed into the second, that one into the third, and so on, so that the regiment, forming only a formless mass on a sunken road, could not wheel about and was shot almost at point-blank range by the Spaniards posted on the neighboring rocks. It was very difficult to disentangle that crush. At last it was done, and the Poles went to reform on the plain under the Emperor's eyes, who praised their courage while blaming the lack of method they had shown in the attack. The leaders admitted as much, expressing regret at not having been led by an experienced general. Then the Major General, Berthier, who wished to do a service to Montbrun, at that moment little in favor, yet whom he knew to be an excellent and very brave cavalry officer, told Napoleon of that general's presence. The Emperor had him summoned and gave him command of the lancers, ordering him to renew the attack. Montbrun was a splendid man, in Murat's style, tall, with a scarred face, black beard, the most martial air, and an excellent horseman. He pleased the Poles, and they having promised to conform to his instructions, Montbrun, after spacing their squadrons and taking all necessary measures, proudly placed himself at their head. He dashed into the defile. Some squadrons were at first shaken by the musketry, but as the several parts of the column had space enough between them to prevent serious disorder, they rallied, and at last they reached the top of the mountain. General Montbrun dismounted, and ran first to the breastworks, to tear up the palisades, under a hail of bullets. The Poles followed his example, the works were carried, they remounted, and the regiment fell upon the Spaniards, making a slaughter all the greater as the ground broadened and sloped downward as far as Buitrago, allowing the lancers to overtake the enemy infantry, which fled in the greatest disorder. The pass carried, the emperor crossed it, and, having reached the summit, not only saw the French flag flying over Buitrago, but caught sight, a league beyond that town, of Montbrun's cavalry pursuing the routed Spaniards. That evening, Napoleon congratulated the Poles, made Montbrun a divisional general, and took him a few months later to Austria, where he handled the division so well that the emperor, in 1810, named him commander-in-chief of all the cavalry of his army of Portugal, and entrusted him with a cavalry corps during the Russian campaign. He was killed at the Battle of the Moskva. Marshal Lannes having examined the position I have just described, we descended the Somosierra and went to sleep at Buitrago, whence we reached Madrid the next day. The emperor had been for a few days in that city, of which he could make himself master only after a serious fight. He had installed his brother, King Joseph, there. Marshal Lannes presented me to Napoleon, who received me kindly, telling me that he would before long reward the conduct I had shown at Ágreda. We found Mr. Gehenuk in Madrid. He wore a colonel's insignia, the rank the emperor had conferred on him on receiving from his hand the battle bulletin of Tudela, stained with my blood. Gehenuk was a good fellow. He came to me and said, "You ran the dangers, and took the saber blow, and I obtained the rank, but I hope you will soon be promoted." I hoped so too, yet I will frankly admit that I bore the marshal some grudge for the obstinacy with which he had made me pass through Ágreda, but one must submit to one's fate. Marshal Lannes was lodged in Madrid in the palace that Murat had occupied. There I found the good counsellor Hernandez, who, learning of my arrival, had come to offer me quarters in his house, which I accepted with all the more gratitude as my wound had become inflamed, and good care was necessary to me. My host lavished it upon me, and I was on the way to recovery when new events forced me to take the field again in the middle of winter. Indeed, we had scarcely been a week in Madrid, when, on December 21st, the emperor, learning that the army of Portugal dared march against the capital of Spain, from which it was only a few days' distance, at once had the general beaten and left the city at the head of his guard and several army corps to move in the direction of Valladolid, by which the English, commanded by General Moore, were approaching. Marshal Lannes, being recovered, was to follow the emperor, no longer by carriage, but on horseback. He told me so, proposing that I remain in Madrid until my wound was completely healed. But two motives prevented me. First, I wished to be present at the battle that was about to be fought against the English. Second, I knew that the emperor almost never granted promotion to the absent, and I was keen to obtain the rank of squadron leader that had been promised me. I therefore made my preparations to depart. One thing alone embarrassed me. Because of my wound to the forehead, I could wear neither hat nor bearskin. My head was wrapped with white handkerchiefs, but that was a poor military headdress to appear in within a staff that was to march constantly with that of the emperor. While this thought troubled me, I saw a Mameluke of the guard, wearing his turban with a red skull-cap. I had a charming red kepi embroidered in gold. I had a fine scarf twisted and sewn around it, which produced a kind of turban that I placed over the bandages and compresses covering my wound. We left Madrid at nightfall to sleep at the foot of Mount Guadarrama, which the emperor wished to cross the next day. It was very hard frost, the road was coated with black ice, the troops, and especially the cavalry, marched with difficulty. The marshal frequently sent officers to make sure the columns were in good order during that night march, but, understanding what I would suffer, he kindly excused me from those rides, while all my comrades were carrying orders. N. And I found ourselves alone beside the marshal. N. made a sign that he wished to speak to me and produced a bottle of kirsch. I thanked him without accepting, but the man put the neck of the flask to his lips and, in less than a quarter of an hour, swallowed all its contents. All at once, he toppled to the ground like a felled colossus. The marshal, unable to contain his indignation, reproached him, to which N replied, "It is not my fault, for there is black ice between my saddle and my thighs." The marshal found the excuse so novel and so odd that, despite his bad temper, he could not help laughing. Then he said to me, "Have him thrown into one of my wagons." I executed the order, and our companion fell asleep on the sacks of rice, amid the hams and the pots. We reached the foot of the Guadarrama during the night, and found there only a very poor village, where we settled as we could. The cold had reached my wound, and I suffered greatly. At daybreak, the army was about to set out, when the advance guard battalions, already engaged on the mountain, fell back, and we were informed, the emperor and the marshal, that a dreadful storm prevented any advance. The snow blinded men and horses. A most violent wind had even just swept several away, and hurled them into a precipice. Anyone else than Napoleon would have halted, but, wishing to catch the English at all costs, he spoke to the soldiers and ordered that those of the same platoon should hold one another by the arms so as not to be carried off by the wind. The cavalry, dismounting, had to march in the same order, and, to give the example, the emperor formed the staff into several platoons, placed himself between Lannes and Duroc, beside whom we took our places, intertwining our arms. Then, at the command given by Napoleon himself, the column moved forward, climbed the mountain despite the violent wind that pushed us back, the snow that whipped our faces, and the ice that made us stumble at every step. I suffered cruelly during the 4 mortal hours that this ascent lasted. Having reached halfway up the slope, the marshals and generals who wore high riding boots could go no farther. Napoleon then had himself hoisted astride a cannon. The marshals and generals did the same. We continued to advance in this grotesque fashion, and at last we reached the monastery on the summit of the mountain. The emperor halted there to rally the army. Wine and firewood were found and distributed to the troops. The cold was intense, everyone was shivering, yet after a few hours we set out again. The descent, though very trying, was much less so than the climb. At nightfall we reached a small plain where stands the large village of Saint Raphael, together with several hamlets that provided the army with provisions, wine, and shelter. My wound, already a little closed when we left Madrid, had reopened, and since my turban covered only the top of my head, the snow had gotten into my neck and nape and melted there. I was soaked through, and our baggage had not arrived, so I passed a very cruel night. In the days that followed, the army continued its march through Espinar, Villacastin, Arévalo, and Medina del Campo. The farther we moved away from the Guadarrama mountains, the milder the temperature became. Soon heavy rains replaced the frost, and the roads turned to quagmires. We crossed the Douro at Tordesillas, where we finally caught up with the stragglers of the English army, which was fleeing at our approach toward the port of Corunna. The emperor, wishing to overtake it before it could embark, pressed the march of the troops, making them cover 10 to 12 leagues per day, despite the bad weather and dreadful roads. This haste led to a reverse that stung Napoleon all the more because it befell a corps of his guard. Here is what happened. The army was bivouacking at Villapanda when the emperor, furious at always chasing the English, was told that their rear guard lay a few leagues ahead of us in the town of Benavente, behind the small river Esla. At daybreak, he sent off a column of infantry, preceded by the Mamelukes and the chasseurs of the guard under General Lefebvre Desnouettes, a very brave but very imprudent officer. This general, reaching the banks of the Esla with his cavalry opposite Benavente, which lies about half a league beyond the water, seeing no enemy, wanted to reconnoitre the town. That was sound soldiering, but a single platoon would have sufficed, for 25 men see just as far as 2,000, and if they fall into an ambush, the loss is at least small. General Desnouettes should therefore have waited for the infantry before rashly plunging into midstream. However, without listening to any objection, he had the entire regiment of chasseurs ford the river and move toward the town, which he had the Mamelukes search. They did not meet a single inhabitant, an almost certain sign that the enemy was preparing an ambush. The French general should prudently have fallen back, as he did not have the strength to contend with a large enemy rear guard. Instead, Desnouettes pressed on, but, while he was passing through the town, 4,000 to 5,000 English cavalrymen swung around it, masking their movement behind the houses of the suburbs, and suddenly they fell upon the chasseurs of the Imperial Guard. Hurrying to get out of the town, our men defended themselves so bravely that they cut a wide gap through the English, regained the river, and recrossed it with no great loss. But once the regiment had reformed on the left bank, it was discovered that General Desnouettes was missing. An enemy parlementaire came to announce that Lefebvre Desnouettes' horse had been killed during the fight, and that the general was a prisoner of war. The emperor arrived at that very moment. Judge his anger when he learned that not only had his favorite regiment just suffered a setback, but its commander had been left in English hands. Although Napoleon was very displeased by Lefebvre Desnouettes' imprudence, he nevertheless proposed to the enemy commander-in-chief to exchange him for an officer of the same rank held in France. But General Moore was too proud of being able to show the English people one of the chiefs of the Emperor of the French's guard as a prisoner of war to consent to the exchange. He therefore refused. General Desnouettes was treated with great consideration, but he was sent to London like a trophy, which further increased Napoleon's anger. Despite this small success, the English had just won over the chasseurs à cheval of the Imperial Guard. They continued their retreat. We crossed the Esla and occupied Benavente. From that town to Astorga is at least 15 to 16 French leagues, and several streams must be crossed. The emperor, however, was so impatient to catch the enemy that he wished his army to cover this distance in a single day, though the days were then very short. We were at December 31st. I have seldom made a march so trying. An icy rain pierced our clothes, men and horses sank into marshy ground, and we advanced only with the greatest effort. As all the bridges had been cut by the English, our infantry were obliged 5 or 6 times to undress, place their weapons and effects on their heads, and step naked into the freezing water of the brooks we had to ford. I say it with regret. I saw 3 old grenadiers of the guard, who, finding it impossible to continue this painful march, and not wishing to remain behind, for fear of being tortured and massacred by the peasants, blew out their brains with their own muskets. A night of the deepest darkness, with ceaseless rain, added to the troops' fatigue. The soldiers, exhausted, lay down in the mud. A great many stopped in the village of Bagneza. Only the heads of the regiments reached Astorga, the remainder stayed along the roads. The night was already well advanced when the Emperor and Marshal Lannes, with no escort other than their staffs and a few hundred cavalrymen, entered Astorga, which was scarcely inspected, so harried was everyone, and so eager to find shelter and warmth. Had the enemy, warned of this, turned back, they might have carried off the Emperor. Fortunately, they were too pressed, and we did not find a single one in the town. At every moment, moreover, more of the French soldiers who had fallen behind were arriving, which ensured the defense of the imperial quarters. Astorga is quite a large town. Everyone hastily found lodging there. We settled Marshal Lannes in a house of rather handsome appearance, near the one where the Emperor took up quarters. We were soaked to the bone, and it was very cold, for we were near the mountains of Asturias. Our servants and baggage did not arrive, yet we had to find some way to get warm. The great fires we lit were not enough. The marshal was shivering. I urged him to take off all his clothes, even his shirt, to roll himself in a woolen blanket, and then to place himself between 2 mattresses, which he did, as did all of us, for the houses, whose inhabitants had all fled, were very well supplied with beds. Thus we ended the year 1808. That concludes the 8th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.